So I've got some notes. There's the notes from the last podcast was that Nietzsche would just go for the leg lock, he'd pull guard, and the second message was the internet shit is nothing. So I think both of those are good places to start out. But the other quote is unlike Jordan Peterson, you wrote this. Unlike Jordan Peterson, I cannot conceive of any advice for young men. A cycling trip as we did, like that 1997 trip, unsponsored and unsupported, and with an internet, a trip like that perhaps can no longer be done. Where can a young man go where his insecurity will be high? Now, you're probably saying, hey, that's a great place to stop. Thank you for the comment or the question. But what they do at Peterson in his lectures, they'll give him like 13 questions like this, and he has no time to make notes. So I'm just going to keep throwing stuff. So if you can mentally park that or take some notes, that's great. Peterson has no ability to do that. You're in front of a crowd. There is more
Well, he's a highly trained Canadian.
He's a highly trained Canadian professional. But other comment. There is more insecurity, risk, and chaos in this civilized world than there is in Patagonia. Okay.
Well, this is a recent observation I've made based on events, but I believe it's true generally speaking, and I think this does tie into a lot of the insecurity that young men feel. They feel it as emotional insecurity, but really what it is a reflection of is the society around them is a lot less stable than it portends to be. And I was recently talking about in regards to monetary loss and like catastrophic events, and how even a small event can turn into something very, very large on a financial level, and particularly within regards to the law and the laws of the state and the legal ramifications of those laws, and how really, if you don't want to be found guilty of something, you need to have the amount of money to be able to save yourself from guilt. And I'm not so sure that this ties in with like existential angst of young men or something like that. I think they feel more of that because they're being told that they're in a place of great security and they should be happy to be there. But the real reality of it is that being in Patagonia in the middle of nowhere is a lot safer than it is being in a civilized Western society.
Well,
the risk of jail is high. Yeah. The risk of being enslaved and stuck, marriage, women, fraud, criminal charges that are even unwarranted that you need to defend yourself from, accidents and the legal ramifications of those accidents, whether or not you are at fault, the necessity to defend yourself against a litigious action, that really is at the center of it. And you don't have that when you're dealing with local people, even if they're bad local people in a place in the middle of nowhere. People take care of themselves and are expected to. And if it gets bad, then you just shoot the guy or beat him up or something, and then the story is over. But if you do that here, that's just the beginning of real potential pain.
Yeah,
you're living in a system. Let me just make this last point. You're living in a system, though, that the ramifications for any action are so vast and so deep and profound that it's very intimidating. And for a young man, I understand that you've got all this energy and all this, but you're being warned and told of all these great dangers, and these dangers really are there. So you're suppressing and repressing a lot of this youthful male energy, and I think that these guys, they turn to video games or drugs, or just wasting their lives in one way or the other, and they're not feeling fulfilled. So a lot of it is it's their best choice. It's a better choice to play video games than to go out and risk yourself that you might be thrown in jail and all these bad things happen to you because of the society.
Right, because you have success.
Supposedly civilized society.
Yeah, I mean, you have success of the video games. I mean, if you can link up with people across the world with the virtual video games and get good at one thing and have a discipline in one thing, obviously that gives you positive reinforcement. And these guys maybe haven't been taught the social skills. They probably don't lack the social skills, but they just haven't been raised in a way that makes them feel comfortable and actually interact with people. So they kind of duck down into this semi-autistic world, and they get their self-esteem from the video games. I can't say if that's a bad thing. maybe they're learning a great skill from the video games. Maybe they're gaining great confidence from it. But I mean, to be trapped by the state and be told that your very ways of making your way forward are not only good but potentially illegal. I mean, that only knocks the wind out of these young guys, but it poisons them, and it sets the wrong systems of rewards and punishments, because they're punished for actually being bold and creative and taking risks and leading society to a new epoch, and they're rewarded for being meek and kind of going underground and digging into the world of software and gaming and coding.
Well, it's certainly confusing. It's certainly confusing to them, and it no doubt for a lot of them it leads to self-hurt and decisions which do hurt themselves. But I don't really. Yeah, I mean, I look back at my decisions and I look at your decisions, and I think that we dealt with these same issues in our own way. Perhaps they weren't.
Let's
as
pull out my decisions
from
from
yours,
because I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'd want to cloud the waters with my decisions. I think your decisions have been very interesting, but my decisions.
Well, I don't think your decisions. Certain things you've done in your life have been very different than what I've done. I mean, you've blown it up and you've rebuilt it a couple of times at least.
What do you think about these guys though? So some of these coders and these developers have kind of become, at least in terms of monetary pull, as big as the Wall Street traders. Do you think it's possible?
Oh, I think they've moved past the Wall Street guys.
Do you think?
I actually don't. I don't. Wall Street's been displaced, especially since 2008 or 9.
The observation I'm trying to make is that, I mean, if you were a social engineer, right, and you're one of these people that wants to engineer society, Peterson would say that's a really bad idea, because you got to let the chips fall how they fall, and human tendencies are very, very hard to change. And social engineering is a very nasty and destructive and arrogant viewpoint. And Scott would probably be, the same main. But if you were a social engineer, and let's say you wanted to say that maybe females should have X amount of power and should be doing X things in society, or I just use that as an example because they're probably the biggest political force out there. And you were trying to get guys on your side. I mean, you probably would want to get the guys who are middle management, middle class, trying to keep intact the nuclear family, feeling that they've been slighted. I mean, those guys are going to probably vote for somebody like Trump. But you could go and go after the guys who are semi-autistic and say, hey, look, competitive society has kind of slighted you, but look, you're superstars now. And wouldn't the women not only want to seduce them, but want to coddle to them, appeal to their white knighthood, and these silicone guys. But
these guys are, before they're social engineers, they're software engineers, and I think that social engineering is very appealing to a software engineering mind, a mind of binary code where things break down very clearly, and they can envision a better code, and they can envision a better game or a better program, and then they can go execute it. And I think given their degree of autism, it's not so far of a stretch for them to start to thinking about the world itself in those same sorts of terms. And that's why I see, all the Silicon Valley people are extremely progressive, extremely into this sort of cultural Marxist stuff. And this is, I mean, Peterson, I don't know if he's gone so far as to say
could they also have been
this is dangerous.
Bitcoin anarchist libertarian guys? I'm saying, is it possible that they were more easily co-opted rather than they're having a natural tendency? And I don't know the answer. I'm just putting it out there.
Well, I think the Bitcoin libertarian guys are the flip side of it. I think it's also an extension of autism to believe in this libertarian world, which is just as theoretical as the world of the cultural Marxists. Both of these are outgrowths of people who spend too much time sitting in front of their computer and not enough time chasing tail in the bar and trying to get laid. these aren't this sort of thinking doesn't come from someone of an athletic
But I'm
background
suggesting that these guys,
a sportsman, or.
But I'm suggesting that these guys maybe are being pursued by women, maybe high status women that have a desire to engage in social engineering and advance their own agenda. And these high status women realize that, what's better than a rich Wall Street guy than an autistic, rich, and powerful software engineer in Silicon Valley, where not only does this guy maybe lack his own political beliefs or understanding of the political system in general, but is very willing to conflate female admiration with the political line of feminism and neo-Marxism.
Yeah, but I think these women who support all this, I'm not sure they're out chasing to marry these guys, get together with them for political reasons. I don't even think they're doing that. I think they're just a bunch of shrill harpies in university.
Yeah, but if you read Morally and Free, you should read what this guy wrote about the ability of women to manipulate. I mean, I'll pull this up while you're.
But I think there's been a cultural and a societal transition, though, from if you start with the gold standard at Nixon in the 70s, you turned the whole Western world, especially America, into a financial and banking center. And you had 40 years of massive credit growth, and the bankers really were taking over the economy and were being able to call the shots politically and socially. And then with the collapses in the 2000s, particularly the last one in 2008, you've seen a displacement of the banking center as the real political and economic driving force. And I think now it's very clear that it's Silicon Valley. And the Silicon Valley people they're kind of autistic.
Why
so
hasn't
really
their volatility?
Money, and they've got so much money anyway.
Why hasn't their volatility?
But the Wall Street people. I mean, now we have Zuckerberg and Bezos calling these shots instead of, Rubin at Citibank or Blankfein or the Goldmans, or I mean any of these Wall Street types. These guys now have been quieted a little bit. Silicon Valley, I think, is the future, and with that, you're getting a movement away from the laissez-faire republicanism, which was always like sort of trying to be a little libertarian in theory, but they didn't really give a shit about that. But now you're going far left wing with the Silicon Valley types. They're total progressives, and they're cultural Marxists, and they see that as a very clear position.
Yeah, but do you think
take.
that any of?
I think because of their software background, it makes sense to them.
I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, so you're basically saying that because of the very structure of what they're doing, it makes sense for them to try to be statists and social engineers. But I mean.
Well, yeah, but they also, I mean, the other important point to note, though, is that we're now more and more living in a virtual world where currency is not created by a central bank, but currency could be as simple as likes and page views. And that world is now functioning with very, very different sort of economics and social practices than the world of New York City Wall Street bankers, which was still, after all, not a virtual thing. The center of power, at least social power, and what influences the politicians, I think, has shifted to San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and the progressives, and it's out of the hands of these laissez-faire Republican banker guys in New York City. That 40-year period is over. Now we're going into like a virtual period, and this favors cultural Marxism. The autistics don't have any sense of history. They don't know about the work camps and concentration camps, labor camps.
But the bankers are always going to have their role. I mean, the bankers are always going to be a source of liquidity and capital. I mean, everybody needs the bankers. I mean,
they're absolutely crucial to the functioning of this system. But at the same time, this system is being expanded in an online direction, of which banking, it doesn't play a big part. The people who own the platforms and the people who can summon page views, that's a new currency in itself. And the bankers they're behind. Those banker guys don't really know technology, and now they're finding themselves behind politically, because politically speaking, the bankers have not been outspoken progressives. I mean, I can't think of a single banker who's spoken out about progressivism, and endorsed I mean, they endorsed Hillary, but I mean, look at even Hillary Clinton. She didn't come around to gay marriage until 2013. I mean, she's not a progressive in any way. So the progressive push is really something totally different. It's an online push more than anything. It's not a New York banking push.
So you don't think these guys, the progressive push is co-opted? You think that these guys actually think that it works in their favor? I mean, you think that their push for the whole feminism bit actually works in their favor? I mean, only in the short term, I think.
It works in the favor of who? The Silicon Valley types?
Yeah, these guys. I mean,
I think it definitely works in their favor. I think it all works in their favor. I think all of that stuff works in their favor. I mean, because the idea is just to have political power. And if you're going to expand the scope of government socially, and you are the platform upon which that push is made, it just benefits their platforms and it benefits them politically. I mean, there's no reason why Zuckerberg is not going to be president eventually.
Would there be any
it seems far-fetched perhaps now, but he's well on his way.
He was very chaste in his very chaste and deferential in his Senate hearing. I mean, he began every sentence with senator, and he put himself on the line. I mean, he kind of made an ass of himself with Ted Cruz, but I mean, I think that he was just trying to prove himself to be deferential and a game player. So yeah, Zuckerberg could definitely be a presidential candidate. I wouldn't be surprised. But I mean, you don't think that these guys would be better fit to have a libertarian government backing them? Because I mean, they would be able to avoid the system that's trying to regulate them. They'd be able to use technology in their advantage to create currencies that other people would use in favor of states. So these guys could be big state breakers and have a lot to gain for it. It seems very illogical for these guys to be pro-state. They don't really need a state. They're the ones making all the bread for the state. The state's trying to take away their money through taxation, and the state is trying to create, enhance their power structure through regulation of.
Yeah, but I think one of the things about autistics is they don't really care too much about money. They understand efficiencies and mathematics, and I mean, I'm really generalizing about autistics right now, but most of them can't function at all. But I'm talking about these high functioning Silicon Valley autistic people. I'm talking about Bill Gates. I'm talking about Zuckerberg. These guys, they believe very clearly in their vision for their software and their platform, and they feel just as strongly socially about their positions. And I think they view both of them as extensions of the same thing. And I mean, but these are people for whom money doesn't matter. I mean, you don't hear about Zuckerberg showing off his money. The guy was wearing the same sweatshirt like every day for a year. I mean, he's not aware of a lot of these social things, especially monetary stuff. So money is not that important. What's more important is to perfect the program, right? And to have some goal and achieve it. I mean, Bezos's goal is just total domination of everything, to have all of the money and have all of the power. And they're going to play the game to the end. That's what these guys do. And the most interesting end goal is a perfect society, is utopia.
So
whether it's a virtual utopia or is it a real
how would
one?
these guys do if they sat down with these German romantics or these German idealists? I mean, these guys were all a bunch of system builders, really smart, very good mathematicians. I mean, it would seem to me that the Germans would sit down with them and say, you're missing a melody, you're missing a myth, you're missing a spirit of greatness, you're missing a great story. There's nothing that's going to lead you to greatness because you don't have a plan. If power itself, control itself is a plan, that's going to lead you to a state of emptiness and nihilism. I mean,
imagine if you could get everybody to commit to being living their entire life on Facebook or online, let's say some online platform, single online platform. And that platform had very specific rules, and you'd be banned or silenced. Anything would happen if you didn't stay within the guidelines of the rules. There was continual oversight by algorithms. Could you not engineer a utopia online, a virtual utopia?
Well, I mean, their intent is to engineer that utopia, but the answer to the question is that
their intent.
The utopian vision might be very real for them. I mean, obviously, the answer is that it's going to destroy the majority of people, such that it destroys the very mass that you're trying to put into this utopia. No, not everybody wants to go. Most people don't want to go into anyone's utopia. And not only do they not want to go, but they'd rather have a shitty and miserable low-tech life than be bossed around by anybody. So these guys
Jordan
aren't going to get
Peterson,
the likes that they want, that they're getting now. When they really get in charge, they're going to have to take away the likes.
I don't know. Look, I don't believe that the utopia even virtually would work, because we're still talking about human beings. We're still not getting rid of human beings. And that has been the Jordan Peterson. I watched his lecture on existentialism with Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard.
A clinical psychologist who does zoological statistics on lobsters is lecturing on these guys.
Well, he might be the best guy to do some of these philosophical this philosophy stuff, since he's more concerned about the therapeutic value of what he's working on than just trying to stump students or create interesting problems and solutions on a chalkboard. But what he did talk about, he brought up the Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky, which I haven't read for a few decades at least. But the Grand Inquisitor, he brought up these great quotes that I'd totally forgotten. But one of the more interesting ones was about how it was about utopia essentially, and even if you were to engineer all of this perfect stuff with reason, man would find a way to be unreasonable and fuck it up. It just to do it in spite of the whole reasonableness of the endeavor, and that really remains the question: can you convince people to be completely reasonable? That continues to be the metaphor about society. I wrote about it a few years ago about man becoming his economic man, which is really a metaphor. This reasonable, rational, always choosing the thing that's in his benefit, individualistic, selfish. This is the capitalist economics man. But could man ever become his metaphor, or is a metaphor just something that can influence him? Is what's essential about a human being something that's still been consistent for as long as we've had writing and we have records? Can that be changed? And Marx tried to change it, Lenin did, Stalin did. We've had these attempts to change it. And I think the internet is offering a new path forward for changing man. And it pretends once again that we can get this and gain this utopia. And the virtual reality may be the way forward for this creation of a utopia. And Jordan Peterson is saying, no, it won't happen.
Well,
but we're using 19th century arguments and 19th century texts. Yeah. And perhaps the texts haven't caught up. We need like something in the computer world to show us that the computers are not the answer.
But for these guys,
because all the computer people are ignoring the past.
Yeah, but for these guys, the utopia is the process of just attempting to make this transformation. It's the thrill of the power struggle. I mean, I think these autistics. They're no different than athletes. Athletes have a short window of euphoria, and they'll never be champions of the world. They might win a world championship, but then they could be a bum the next day. And I don't think these autistics care about the aftermath. The utopia that they're trying to go for is the process of gaining power, and they're living right now in the midst of a utopia. When the utopia ends is the question, how it ends. I mean, they'll be overturned. Once they reveal their fangs and people realize that these people want to control them, there'll be a resistance and they'll get knocked down. But in the meantime, these guys, until they're called out for what they're doing, they're living their utopian dream right now. They're getting that euphoria of power that will never be equal. There will never be an equal of that euphoria of power when they finally get the so-called power. It then will.
But I think there's something diabolical about it, though, is that we're talking about sick people who have risen to a certain degree of power. If we're talking about a guy like Bezos, a guy like Zuckerberg, a guy like Gates, these people are designing the platforms and the places and the environments at which everyone is meeting. Healthy people included are being forced to meet there and meeting there under the rules that these guys are setting. And these are not guys who are these are socially inept people. These are people for which their emotional lives are very stunted or not even existent. These are people who don't understand social cues. These are people who don't understand affection and love, perhaps not even anger, really. They're people who are closer to being computers than they are to being men. And these are the people who are designing the social framework. And so if these people do want to institute something like utopia, their utopia is going to be it was something that probably is also going to be very different from like a Marxist utopia. Yes, they see that being nice to people is something that has to happen, and everyone needs to be at the same level, equals at the same level, however they're defining that. But usually that kind of means like men and women would be able to achieve the same thing. All men and all women would be able to achieve the same thing. That equality of outcome instead of equality of opportunity. That seems to be one of the goals.
So how do these guys believe in equality of outcome? I mean, it seems obvious to them that they're doing so well in the midst of their competition with other men. How can they possibly believe in equality of outcome? They've had neither equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. The autistic was shunned and castigated to nearly retarded ranks, and now he's risen to, the great knight, the great defender of the currency, the great defender of structure and order and power. I mean, they've become the knights.
Well, the whole idea of the idea of equality of outcome, it doesn't make it only makes sense if you reduce everyone to a very impoverished level, and that also you stop someone from being a great basketball player, and you maybe have to remove his left arm so that he's only as good as the worst student in the school or something. To really get everyone equal would mean a great reduction in ability across the board for the most part, to the lowest of the low.
So it's kind of like the mafia taking out their competition. I mean, these guys are basically taking out their competition.
Yeah, I mean, they want to put women on the front lines of fighting battles and things, and for some reason they think women it can be replacements for the same men that were fighting those battles. And I mean, it's all quite ridiculous. You have to ignore a lot of historical features and a lot of physiological features to be able to believe that. I mean, there was just that whole thing about like a man who had a sex change, and was allowed to fight women in MMA, and I guess he just beat the hell out of them.
You see the 800 meters of the Olympics?
Was there a man masquerading as a woman who won?
I mean, one. I mean,
really?
Yeah. I mean, what do you know about the 800 meters? Do you know anything about that race?
Yeah, I used to be all right at that. I used to be pretty good.
I wish we had Joe Rogan's assistant to pull this up.
I would have won, but my times could win the Olympics for women. My best times would win the Olympics. I mean, I didn't know back then that I could have become a woman and been an Olympic champion.
So
could have.
If you go to YouTube and I'm looking up Olympic. So the last Olympics was 2016, I think. So if you do like Olympics 2016 women's, I think this was on Rio, 800 meters. It's her name is Semayena, but if you watch it, just look at the guns on this gal, and she destroys.
Is she a man or is she a woman? Is she a woman?
Well, they say. Look. I mean, if you go to this YouTube, just the first, it looks like a really scary guy. Have you seen this?
But what is she?
It's a guy. It's a guy. It's a guy. It's a guy.
Oh, it is a guy
who wins the women's. Yeah.
I thought in the Olympics though they were still doing it by birth sex. You couldn't actually, because wasn't there a guy who also became in the late 70s became a pro tennis player on the women's circuit, and he destroyed.
Yeah, she wins by 10 meters.
So this was a guy. They let a guy beat the women.
Yeah, I mean, that's just one example. I mean, I don't know if the autistics would even be able to distinguish between that in their own field, but.
But I think the people who are more thought out about the whole cultural Marxism thing and the equality of opportunity, these are not Silicon Valley people who are arguing with Jordan Peterson. These people have a very ill thought out idea of their own utopia. The Zuckerbergs and the Bezoses and the Gateses of the world. The people like Google, you don't hear from them. They're not getting into these debates. I think they have a very unhistorical, very, very silly idea of equality that they haven't thought out, and they don't even really care to think it out. And the people who are in the debates are people from universities, and these are the people fighting Peterson, but these aren't the Silicon Valley people. So I think a lot of this, a lot of the fighting that's going on, is once again by people who have nothing to do with political and social power and economic power. These people are university figures still, foremost, and we're just hearing it very loudly because of the platforms of YouTube, and because there's been so much indoctrination on the university campuses, and this has kind of spread out into the wider culture. But this is still, I would say that it's still confined to universities. These are not people with any money, so to speak.
Right. So
Peterson probably has got a lot more money than they do.
Yeah, Peterson has a lot more notoriety. I think that the universities, I mean, especially as if there's going to be social engineering, if there's going to be a cultural war, they're going to recognize that the universities have been co-opted, and then they're going to begin to clean them out, and they're going to, just as they have not allowed anybody with an alternative opinion in comparative literature and philosophy and all these different studies programs. I mean, they're going to be able to just turn it in the other direction. But the question is, you have these guys controlling the framework of expression in Northern California. How are they going to coordinate with the university? It seems like they have been.
Well, I think they have coordinated. They definitely have. The universities are the mouthpiece on these platforms. They're the loudest mouthpiece. And but there's certainly Jordan Peterson's side, which has spoken up. The question is, on Jordan Peterson's side, do the people, this crowd that he's amassed, are these people, is this just the flavor of the month? Is this just a side they've chosen because they want to be part of a crowd, part of a rampaging crowd, and they want to get into a fight and get the meaning from fighting? I interpret it a lot like that.
No, I think a lot of these people are trying to solve their own problems. I mean, I think it's a good force, because if he's telling people that don't join politics, don't join the crowds, don't join the masses, I mean, that's his message. Focus on yourself.
But I would be suspicious. I'm suspicious of anyone who's got a big crowd like that. I was suspicious of the social justice warrior types with the big crowds. And now, as Peterson's crowd grows and grows, I become suspicious of his crowd. And to tell you the truth, one of the reasons I think Peterson can have a crowd is because what he's saying is the flip side of the problem. And I would say that the problem itself, if you really are the philosopher that needs to deal with this problem, you would make both sides dissolve by what you would say. I mean, that's Wittgenstein's whole position, which is to make problems disappear. Peterson has not made this problem disappear at all. He's just given a very more focused and concrete language to the opposition side, which had not really come together forcefully philosophically as the social justice side had. He's given the anti-Derrida position, the anti-comparative literature position, and he's done it really forcefully. But the real philosophical challenge is so that Peterson's position and their position would both evaporate. I mean, that's the goal of philosophy, is to make problems disappear, not to antagonize the other group.
I mean, could he be?
It's to let the fly out of the fly bottle. Could he be just
offering as an intermediary step to those who are most reachable?
I think he is.
I mean, he's not. I think that the eventual solution that you're suggesting would be indistinguishable from the nihilistic tendency of the deconstructionists to the mass audience, to the refined audience. I mean, your answer is brilliant, and it's obviously the ultimate solution. Don't be.
Well, the solution is very nuanced. The solution to make both Peterson's side and the far left side disappear is a very nuanced one, and it's also very dangerous. It's not towing the line anymore between chaos and order, as he's put it. It's somewhere breathing air that's nihilistic. But it's also finding meaning. It's really stepping into a dangerous territory.
He is doing something which is somewhat populist, but I think his populism is driven by his patients and his students, and he can't help but see
and that wonderful Toronto accent.
Well, I mean,
I love that Toronto
Saskatchewan
accent.
actually. I mean, he's in
Saskatchewan.
Toronto. I mean, he actually,
Yeah.
he was offered he was up for a professorship at Harvard. He taught there.
Yeah, I was
He
reading
taught there
about
for
that.
4 years, and I think for him, Canada was just his roots. I mean, I think this guy likes to be close to nature and being close to a good fishing spot. Mostly, being close to Seward, where he can get the freshest halibut and black cod and Pacific cod. And I ate Alaska salmon on Friday, and it was probably about a year old, but frozen. And
Oh, I'm sure it's still good.
God,
was it red?
it was absolutely red. It was beautiful Alaska salmon. And I remember when I was out fishing with Charles, we were fishing with salmon. I rinsed this salmon off that we barely used and cooked it that night. And probably the freshest fish you'd ever have. Even sitting out in the rain in Seward for 6 hours, that's still way fresher than you'll ever eat. But so Peterson's Peterson's from the north, and he's in Toronto, but he's driving around in his RV and is sharing his message. But I think that being in your RV with your wife is the solution at the end of the day.
But let me just interrupt though, because he turned away from Harvard, and it's like you're kind of saying that he maybe did it because Boston might have been a little too tough, maybe tough at the time, and he's a northern man, he wants to be in nature. But look what he's done right now. I mean, he's got a management team that's booking shows with Live Nation, a tour. He's got his daughter is out there. I think she's got management, and she's doing speaking on dietary stuff. I mean, his family has become this big commercial fine-tuned machine of ideas and proselytizing. And he's being fought everywhere. I mean, there's probably going to be attempts on his life. I mean, he's chosen something suddenly a lot more dangerous than teaching at Harvard. And he's very much embracing it. He probably thinks it's a lot of fun. After, suffering to write Maps and Meaning, and then no one buys the book. And now 15 years later or so, 20 years later, he's a superstar. So it's probably very exciting, but I think he probably sees at the same time that he's a fad. He's something that is gonna pass.
Well, I mean,
deep down, he thinks that he's fighting a very important battle.
Writing a bestseller, I don't think is something he could have predicted. I mean, his Maps of Meaning was pretty well followed and reviewed. I mean, I think that the academics recognized it, but
I don't think so. I think the academics ignored it, because the philosophers didn't take it seriously, and the psychologists wouldn't take it seriously. So there was no discipline with which it was addressed. That's what I think kind of happened with that.
Well, I mean, you have a point. I mean, he wasn't making waves at the university, probably in the waves that he's making right now. But I mean, getting out and actually giving talks and speaking with people and answering questions. I mean, that's the ancient tradition in philosophy. That's something,
and it should be pointed out that he was always excellent at that. I think there were even from the Harvard days, there were stories of him, like the students crying at the last day of class, and people were so affected by this guy. So this is not something new. This guy's been doing this at a small scale for a long
you
time.
would ask me. You'd ask me to read
people.
some John Gray. The last time I read Gray was in Eugene, but I'm mildly familiar with his work. Not the level of proficiency I should have now, but I mean, you made the observation that Gray really wasn't somebody that was regularly contacting people and engaging, and he was almost like a miser who was able to have this bitter view of the West. And I don't know if his view is really bitter, but I mean, if Gray was out in his RV with his wife, traveling around the country, speaking with people, I mean, like what? Do you think that he would actually spark any interest in people? I mean, I think that saying something that extreme without having real practical examples to work through it.
Well, there's no therapeutic aspect to Gray unless the therapy is, it's like Nietzsche being therapeutic. He does philosophy with a hammer. He smashes the idols. That is its own sort of therapy. But Peterson is he's trying to smash things, but he is actively trying to build something. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's a depressive, and he's had to deal with probably thinking about killing himself all the time. And it's such a struggle just to want to live. It leads to like kicking yourself in the ass to be optimistic, to try and do something. And I think someone like Gray, who is, at least not that I've heard, is not a depressive. He just is someone who has thought through all of the repercussions of certain philosophical ideas in the West, and seeing how the atheists who think they're atheists are really more Christian than even the most virulent Christians. Like when he's making points like this and then destroying things, he's shattering the foundations for all sides at the same time. And I don't think that Peterson wants to shatter every foundation. He still needs a platform upon which to stand, to get going every day. And I think as a therapist, he's not interested in people, being suicidal. He's trying to do the opposite. So you have to advance an idea. And anytime you start advancing ideas, you open yourself up to being shattered by some Nietzschean guy or some John Gray guy with a big hammer. And I'm not sure Peterson's ideas all hold up from that hammer. And Gray I think Gray would be critical of some of the positions advanced and the foundational stuff advanced by Peterson. And in many ways, I think Gray is someone he's a more extreme version of Peterson. And if you get more extreme, then you're moving very close to nihilism. You're having this. It's a very wicked and acute belief that you need to be able to wade into those waters, and you have and to believe then is a whole other level of belief. It's almost you need some mystical idea to be able to do it, and you'd have to just shut the hell up, which is of course Wittgenstein's point as well. If you really want to do philosophy, silence is the answer. If you really want to be religious, silence is the answer. And that's not something that Jordan Peterson has ever said, that silence is the answer. And he's not even saying it in his own life. The guy has more words than anyone I've ever heard. The guy's talking every day. He's got a new video up every day.
Right. I mean,
silence is what you aspire to. The quieting of the problems, the dissolution of the problem, so that you're just quiet about it and you're calm about it. That peace.
That's the ultimate stage. But I think if you have people that are trapped within a certain expressive society, whether it's social media or whether it's just this crowd formation as you made. I mean, there's a certain process of decaffecting, of bringing people away. And so, I think that's where he's going. He's saying there's these systems that are trying to entangle you and trying to take your energy in a very negative way and pull you in a lot of directions. And so it's a question of.
But he's created. What at least in the existentialism YouTube video I watched, which was quite good, but he made a big point about the crowd and the crowd not being truthful. But the crowd it begins to represent truth, and people within the crowd believe that because it's a crowd, it must be truthful. That's the criticism that he's talking about of crowds, but that applies to him. He's created a crowd, and he's the mouthpiece for a great crowd. And he yet is arguing, though, this crowd is truthful. The whole point that I would advance is, if you've ever got a crowd behind you, you're probably doing a lot of bullshit, because crowds are never truthful. And I'm saying this as a trader. I was always a trader that faded the market. Whenever the market was going in one direction, I was just fighting it. I was fighting it, losing. I never went with it. I have never gone with a crowd. And I don't think any of the philosophers, and none of the philosophers even that he cited, have ever gone with a crowd. And now Peterson here, citing these philosophers and citing these ideas and these books he's created.
But isn't that
does that mean something? Does that mean something's been successful, or does that mean something has gone badly wrong with these ideas?
You could call balls and strikes. The strikes would be that he's been too prescriptive, and there's too many people that are going to stumble with his message, and his message is very unilateral. But there's the other viewpoint that he's just opened up the possibility of creating your own solution. And that's what people have been looking for. They want to maintain their autonomy, and he's offering them the ability to maintain their autonomy, not listen to something prescriptive. He's giving them a very open-ended framework for which to solve a problem. And the more independent-minded people who are maybe the potential leaders of the world, listen to his stuff and say, look, we've been the wisdom message has been withheld from us. He's giving us a wisdom method for which there's many alternatives, many alternative interpretations. But he's at least given us what he says is wisdom. It might be shitty wisdom or bad wisdom, but he's saying it's historical wisdom. He says you have to understand God. You have to understand the concept of God in the West. It's Christian, it's pagan, it's Jewish. And here's that framework. Here's the strength that it's given other people. Now you can take it or leave it. But I mean, I think the fact that he's showing his cards, it's attractive to people with open minds. And
it's wonderful. It's wonderful. The question though is the people that he is assisting with these ideas, and these are excellent ideas. And I'm
saying maybe they're not the losers. I'm
referring more to the idea of this crowd that is created behind him. And I'm not of a believer that this crowd has been formed around these particular ideas. I think this crowd, as crowd formations go, as Canetti has described them in his Great Crowds and Power, when crowds begin to develop, they get adherents and new adherents, and they grow in power. And the only way they grow in power too is if they have some force pushing their growth. And Peterson is continually stoking the growth of this crowd. He most definitely is. And the question now then becomes, is the crowd itself a crowd that is gathered around these ideas, or is it just a crowd that is drawing people in because a crowd is formed? And I think that he's gotten well past the point of the ideas, and I think it's just a crowd growing because a crowd is formed. And people perhaps have seen the social justice crowd, and that's drawn a lot of people in, and now they're getting drawn in by this kind of crowd. And I don't think that anyone on either side is really legitimately interested in ideas. I think they're interested in conflict and being a part of something big, and having that feeling of riding the crowd, this Dionysian idea.
Could you have a crowd? Could you have a crowd leader influence the crowd in such a way that they believe in the dissolution of their own crowd formation?
Well, I mean, you know what's interesting is that you remember the French Revolution. There was Robespierre, who was kind of considered to be a thug, I guess, historically, but he was a great speaker, great orator. And he motivated all this killing and stuff. And they said that Robespierre, he gave his final speech, and this was his final speech, but it was totally lacking in enthusiasm. All these people had gathered. This was the height of the French Revolution. All these people had gathered. They'd had the guillotine running for days and days. The heads were piled high. Robespierre gives his speech, and it fell totally flat. And he kept pushing, and it just fell flatter and flatter and flatter. And guess what? They beheaded Robespierre the next day or something like that. I mean, that's what happens to the guys who stoke the crowd. Because the crowd lost the ideas of the French Revolution at that point. It was just a crowd of killing and a crowd of vengeance. And the guy who was that was pushing the crowd forward and the vengeance forward, it could be directed back at him.
You're trying to say that Peterson should have an O'Hare hedge at the end of his lecture series.
Yeah, he's got to have a one-way ticket somewhere. Maybe
what is the O'Hare edge again?
He should definitely choose a socialist country. They'll never look for him there.
Yeah,
the O'Hare hedge, where you I don't know, go into a big Fed number in the morning. You decide before you get there you're going to go long the Treasury bond and like big size.
Short, nothing else. It's a one-way bet.
One way, and then you buy a ticket to Brazil, one way to Brazil, and either one of two things.
From O'Hare Airport, right? From O'Hare Airport, because you're a Chicago futures trader. I mean that's the metaphor.
O'Hare Airport. You got your taxi lined up outside of the Chicago Board of Trade, waiting for you. The number comes out, and bonds go up. You stay there, and you get high fives, and you make millions. And if bonds go down, you run for the taxi and you say, get to O'Hare as fast as you can. You try and get on that plane before someone stops you. Because you're done, man. You're toast. All the money's gone. Everything's gone.
And once you're there, Brazil's a paradise.
Yeah, the clearinghouse can't find you. Nobody can find you. I mean, I probably can't do this anymore. But there's probably a lot of failed traders living on the beaches of Rio,
or maybe up north if they're smart. I mean, there's a lot of big.
Yeah, well, maybe now they're really worried. They're worried about the internet and stuff and getting chased. Maybe they've retreated into the Amazon. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think eventually one day Peterson is going to fall flat, and that's the nature of these crowds. I mean, he needs to continually grow this crowd if it's going to continue.
What if he's driven by his own work?
And
what if he's driven by his own life's work? And so when he's done his tours and he wants to just go back to his cabin, what if he just says, leave me the fuck alone? I mean, what if
you can't do that. I mean, if the crowd is still there, you can't do that. I mean, you don't think I mean, Peterson's basically left academia. He was kicked out. His funding was taken away. I mean, you don't think that he could do the same and just basically say, "Look, I had some material, but now I'm done working. Now I want to go spend time on a ranch, spend time with my family." I mean, I think that's no one would call him on that. That's a legitimate move for him to do. I mean, just to get out of the spotlight. Say, "Look, if it didn't work, that's how the chips fall." Yeah, I don't know. I mean, could Robespierre try that? Be like, hey, yeah, we got the revolution done. Cut off a lot of heads. I'm just gonna head over to that winery that I was working at before. Just chill out at the chateau.
I mean, he did. I mean, he didn't have.
No. What do you mean you can't?
He didn't have the ability to do that based on the ability to travel, the ability to just.
Can't. I mean, you can't retire from the revolution. You got to keep it going. Castro couldn't retire. I mean, retirement is death at this point, man.
Well,
the crowd is going to take your head.
Why is Scott enjoying such a nice life?
Well, Scott never had this following. Scott is a quiet academic. Peterson is a phenomenon. He's. I mean, when's the last time there's been a phenomenon like this? I mean, who was the last thinker who was he is.
But I mean, I feel that way about
America
Scott
not having public intellectuals.
I mean, I look over when I was reading Scott.
Yeah, but no one knows Scott.
No, it was funny. I was reading Scott in Brazil, and I was reading Scott when I was back in Oregon. And when I was at this one place in Oregon, it was a left wing hotbed. This particular cafe, and I look over my shoulder when I was reading Scott because I felt his ideas were so powerful and dangerous to the left, which is funny because now there's this contention that Scott's really a Marxist. I'd never been able to figure out that, but I was looking over my shoulder because I was afraid that the Marxists would see what I was reading. And I guess, I mean, how has Scott not fueled international movements? I guess maybe he hasn't, but it seems like...
Well, I think it's because he's never spoken out against his university, and he's never spoken out against the
his university's treated him very well. I mean, nobody's tried to bust his hustle,
right?
And I wonder if Peterson had stayed at Harvard, nobody would have messed with him. The Canadians are kind of getting like the Swedes, I think.
Well, Peterson was very outspoken. And Scott has not been outspoken really about anything.
But Peterson really been so outspoken by having maps of meaning and philosophical lectures on YouTube. I mean, I think it was he got.
No, he spoke out against that. He spoke out against that bill, that gender pronoun bill, and that infuriated. Because I think Toronto's a real progressive left-wing hotbed. So his speaking out against that caused a massive uproar that drew attention in America, and then he's just built the crowd from that original
right. But outside of that, I mean, I don't think he would have gotten in the mix. I think Scott might have been on the side of Peterson too, because he's basically saying that it doesn't matter what type of intellectual framework you want to create for society. The fact that you're trying to create one.
Well, if Scott had some cojones, he would have banded together with other academics who felt like he did, and wrote a letter protesting the decision of the Canadian government and in support of Peterson. the intellectuals of Europe used to do this. They still do this occasionally. They get together and sign their name to something. I mean, that would be the thing to do. And I mean, Scott didn't do that. I mean, he writes theoretical stuff, or he writes very specific stuff about people nobody cares about, some hill people in Southeast Asia.
But Scott kept his cards close to his vest. I mean, he could have.
His anarchism book is really,
right.
really abstract.
And then the other thing is that like during the Vietnam War, instead of being a Vietnam War protester, he went and did studies with the Hill people and kept it very academic. And then that very dry approach, which everybody thought, no, Scott's got nothing. He's no risk. Make him full professor. He's man of the establishment. And then he does a judo flip on people and takes this data that everyone said was incontestable and great, makes him a full professor. And he says, well, it's evidence that the state is actually not such a great thing. And so maybe that's the route that Peterson has been taking, is that he picks his battles. He's not going to hit up certain controversies that waste his time. Scott might think that Peterson is obviously doing fine on his own. So why risk anything?
There's also another path. There's also another path, which is the Ted Kaczynski path, and you could blow people up from a little cabin somewhere and write a manifesto that nobody understands, and there's that path as well. And I think if you're looking at sheer numbers and crowd formations, and if that's a sign of truth, which Peterson says is not, he's the one with the biggest crowd. He's the one with the most backers.
Because Kaczynski, Kaczynski was a really smart guy, but if you get to the nitty gritty of like what he actually did, it's loony. What he did was absolutely loony, and I get being torn apart where you build your cabin and then someone builds a freeway. I mean that I get the feeling of destruction and all that around you, but I mean. The way to deal with that is to either engage in it in the capitalist society and buy up that land, or prevent the development through legal means, or engaging in some way, just fighting an actual fight, and then putting your head in the sand and mailing bombs to random secretaries who are getting their hands blown off. I mean it's absolutely fucked up.
It's interesting though is that
it's cowardice, but I mean. His writing is great, but the guy has got no life skills. I mean, my feeling on Kaczynski is that he's a smart guy, but he just he's total autistic.
Well, I think that's true. He's a mathematician guy. He's a lot closer, I think, to the Silicon Valley people than he is to the social justice types.
Dangerous, a dangerous guy, because he doesn't connect. He doesn't connect.
He's a bit. Well, his treatise is a brilliant work for me of mathematics. He's created this systematic way of looking at the world, and if you agree with all of the terms, what x and y are all equal to, it turns out to be a beautiful equation. But the reality, though, is that the world is not that way. All of his terms he's defined is not exactly the way the world operates, so in many ways he's a totalitarian. I mean, he's just closer to like a right-wing sort of fascist guy who wants to control everything.
A calculated guy
with a very conservative bent.
Guy like Kaczynski, I mean, for him to actually think that there's a good solution in mailing bombs, that's ridiculous. I mean, he knows that the odds of the bomb doing something or hitting the right person or whatever. I mean, he obviously has to realize mathematically that's absolutely absurd.
Well, I guess he was thinking there was a chance.
I think he lost his marbles.
Did the same thing happen in? Didn't the same thing happen in Terminator? Like Terminator 3? Like they went back in time to try and kill the scientist who turned on the computers that would create all the Terminators and all the damage. I mean, it's kind of the same fear. And in one movie, you watch it thinking, kill that doctor, kill that scientist. You gotta kill that guy before he turns the computer on. Well, that's just exactly what Kaczynski was trying to do.
Cameron,
God damn it, the Terminators are coming.
That director Cameron. I mean, he's been knocking against the West ever. I mean, is that Avatar movie?
It's
That
pretty,
Avatar movie is the same.
the
Is
Terminator
the
stuff's
same
pretty
iteration.
pro Kaczynski. I mean, you might as well. I mean, the Terminator 4 might as well be
Right,
about
but
the
I mean,
Unabomber,
but Cameron in his movies, I mean, I think he's at least giving people a fair fight. Kaczynski, I mean, he's not declaring war on anybody, and he isn't sending bombs to destroying anything other than just.
Yeah, but the point of that Terminator one though is that they had I remember, I don't know which one it was, but they had to kill a scientist, and that scientist did not know that he was going to cause all of this terror. No, there was one.
Oh,
there was a black guy. There's a black scientist.
Number two. That was the one with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yep. Well, the first one was with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Well, no, I don't know if it was number 2. I don't know, whichever one it was.
It's when Arnold Schwarzenegger becomes the
later.
friend.
I think it was 3. No, it was after that. It was one of the lesser Terminators. It was 3 or 4, if there's 4. I don't know. Anyway, but the idea though is that the movie has the premise essentially. You've got to go back in time and kill a guy who is basically innocent. He's guilty because of what happens in the future, a future that may or may not come to pass depending upon whether you kill him or not. And I think Kaczynski was operating under the same idea. He believed he knew the future. He saw the future. Because he has a very conservative vision of how things should operate, which is what the Peterson resolution has as well. Peterson is very.
The resolution is that murder.
I mean, what we're talking
happen,
about here is
right?
We're talking about
the resolution is that you can only kill somebody.
Peterson's not saying that. Peterson's not saying that, but he's saying that the side he's fighting against is going to murder eventually, and that's why he needs to be outspoken. But I would say that anytime you get a crowd behind you, the chance of murder gets going pretty high. And Peterson's now got his crowd. So the chances of violence are more
fine.
But
contrast it. When does the state murder? The state uses a monopoly of violence. When do they decide that murder is a good idea? When is war a good idea for the state? Because I'm trying to contrast it with when these guys give up and say, look, you can't deal with these people. You have to shut them down. You have to socially castigate them. Create economic warfare on them. So I'm trying to say.
Well, what is? I mean, a state though is. I always considered, and I think Scott considers it too. The state is an extension of an economic interest, which is the landholders and the owners of capital, and it opens up new territories or it defends territories that are already held for economic development. And so I don't know if we're talking about a territory here, if you're talking about social justice warriors versus right wingers, but we are talking about perhaps a virtual territory, which is this internet territory. Whether that is worth actually killing people for, is that a space that could be opened up for economic exploitation and held by capitalists? And I think you could very well argue that.
But the social justice warriors.
So we may not be far away from actual
social
violence.
Justice warriors. I mean, they're ineffective people with a lost voice. I believe they're going to, not be heard eventually. I don't think they're significant. But you have a Silicon Valley collective that is associated with the left wing, and the question is do they really continue with the left wing, or do they continue with something which may well be more consistent with their autistic personalities? I mean, a libertarian utopia versus a left-wing socialist utopia might be the war that the next war that the left or the right can't even predict. There's an internal.
Well, I think you're right. I think there's autistics on both sides. I mean, Peter Thiel is one of these libertarian autistic kind of people types, and he. That whole his whole PayPal thing was supposed to be a libertarian experiment. He abandoned it. It didn't work. He made tons of money, but you definitely have these people lining up against each other. Social justice or these Silicon Valley types who see this potential, utopia with their ideas of equality versus libertarians who just want to let everything go, and Bitcoin people, and both are very inhuman ideas. And both will lead to bloodshed. Utopia only really ends up that way. And if they're going to battle out online, I don't know. I guess that's how it's playing out. But I'm not sure. I mean, how many libertarian people? I guess libertarians are behind Jordan Peterson. I mean, he's got a motley crew of people, whether they're some alt-right racist people are in there and libertarians. There are a lot of people probably sympathetic to his ideas. But I would say the majority are just crowd followers who want to be a part of one side or the other. That's the way that people are really only getting meaning in their life right now.
Well, I mean, these guys are trying to corral the crowds.
And,
I mean, they're trying to corral the crowds in terms of, ethnographic tendencies. I mean, they're basically saying that, look, if you're Western European and you've been told that you're bad, you're actually good because your bloodline has led to a certain IQ, and that IQ has led to a certain degree of conscientiousness. That conscientiousness has led to a certain degree of cooperation, which led to democracy, in which if you're going to negotiate with people in a democracy, you have to be on the same playing field with them. And so you have now this immigration focus, and you have a political activism that says, look, value your European heritage, value your IQ, value your historical contribution to your own state. And so,
but all these ideas are old ideas, whether they're racist or whatever they are. But they're all being used for one thing, which is just to create crowds and movements. And I think I said it before in a podcast we might have lost, which is that we live in a time of crowds and crowd formations more than in a time of ideas. Because the crowd is really only about itself, about keeping itself growing.
You said that was lost. I'm an accountant. This is a time of great crowd formations. I've got that on paper. That'll never go away.
But they're being abetted. All right, it's on paper, but they're being abetted by technology, and I think the technology is
well, that was what you were trying to say, but do not smoke the vinyl. Or the social, the technology itself.
We
have created no alternatives,
but it's embedded in the technology. It's embedded in the technology itself.
Admirers.
You will not be heard unless you can create a crowd.
Well,
but the technology itself says you cannot be heard unless you make a crowd, and the only way you want to hear something is if it's already created a crowd. So crowds are the only thing people want to hear. They're not really interested in ideas anymore. It's the thing that everyone's looking at, the thing that everyone's listening to.
The strong arm of,
and it's just to be a part of a group
of politics and of the left wing and then now the right wing is the crowd. So they're using social media platforms to foment the crowd, but then you have the problem of the left wing controlling the actual platform.
The crowd. I'm just saying that the crowd just so happened to get behind Peterson. Crowd formations that you don't always know how they start, but then when they start, they take on their own life, and that's where Peterson is at right now. I think he's under the false impression that he's actually able to direct this thing that seems to be behind him. He's not. This is a very powerful wave that will just as easily crush him, just like Robespierre got the guillotine the day after
Peterson
a bad speech.
got lucky.
Well, he's getting lucky every day. The guillotine awaits.
Well, I mean, lucky insofar as that Peterson didn't really have an answer. He just had an idea that was popular at a time. It filled a void.
But I'm saying he didn't really have an idea that's popular. I don't think he has any popular ideas. I think he's created a crowd and he's riding it. And he's an orator and he's fiery and he's emotional. And it's getting people fired up for things they probably don't even understand. I mean, he's got so many people watching these YouTube videos, which is pretty heavy philosophical stuff. I don't think they're really getting it completely, and that's not the point. The point is that they come away feeling better about themselves, which is what a clinical psychologist is always trying to do in a therapy session anyway, isn't it? You're paying the guy to feel better, and you might just be feeling better because he's a great rhetorician. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that if it keeps you from suicide another day.
That's a shitty therapist. I mean, I think that one that
I'm not being, and I don't want to be too cynical about it because I know I do agree that there are people who are listening to Peterson who really dig what he's saying and like it. But I'm saying this crowd is much too big and it's a lot less manageable than he thinks it is, and it doesn't include people who actually understand what he's talking about.
I mean, if you think about all the people that go to college. And if you think about all the people that feel like they got ripped off from going to college, I mean, that's a pretty big movement. And if they are missing something correct, and he's giving them something correct. I mean, you might say that it's one of these lucky deals where, I mean, it's a crowd, but it's not a bad crowd. It's a good crowd. I mean, he's bringing on a good crowd.
Look, he knows, and he said it in that existentialism lecture. There are no good crowds. The crowd is always untruth. The crowd is not truth. The crowd is bad.
Well, I mean, he's not creating a crowd. A crowd is following him.
He quotes Nietzsche and Kierkegaard on this.
A crowd is following him, but it's a group of individuals. I mean, so it's a different type of crowd. You know, I mean, like looking at that crowd, none of them want to join together.
It's a group of individuals.
I mean, I think that, you know, as opposed to being a group of people that want to lose their identities, it's a group of people that all want to gain their identities. It's the anti-crowd.
No, I think a lot of what Peterson is, you know, if I look out my window and I see 1,000 people gathered somewhere at the end of the block, I think I get curious and I wonder what it's about, and I go down there, and suddenly I'm a part of this crowd, and I'm not really sure what it's about, and people are excited, and everyone's, you know, it seems to be a fun time. There's some interesting people there that I meet, and I don't even know why I'm there, and you know, something's going to speak, something's going to happen. I think that's what the point is that a lot of people are desperate for something to happen, something meaningful to happen.
Well, I mean, I experienced that in Brazil in 2014. I mean, I marched in these protests and played music, but I had no idea what people were actually protesting. The idea was that the raise in the metro fee was insulting because they were spending all this money on the Olympics, and there was all this fraud that, you know, why don't you guys have the money to at least, you know, hold down metro fees, you know, 12 cents. So, I mean, people just protest because they're pissed off and they want to make themselves heard. But I mean, if he's bringing out people that actually want to do their own thing, each person, and not join a crowd, I mean, how is he not the anti-crowd philosopher? I mean, I think that.
So you're saying he could be. He's making a crowd of people who are not wanting to be in a crowd. He's got a crowd which is composed of people who are against crowds.
I mean, they would basically say, "Look, I mean, this crowd would be so shy of itself. I mean, it would never want to move together, and it would never want to. If it gathered in one place, each participant would have a note card with its own questions. And when those questions have been answered or haven't been answered, they would leave and go in their own direction, rather than a crowd looking for consensus. I mean, I don't think this crowd wants consensus. I think this crowd.
No, the crowd doesn't. The crowd is itself a consensus. It's a gather. Any gathering is a consensus, and it doesn't have to have any tenets or any ideas really. A gathering is its own sort of false idea of truth, and perhaps you're just saying that a crowd of people gathered who aren't really thinking about or interested in gathering because they're interested in these ideas and they just happen to be there. I mean, I don't think that's ever happened before. It wouldn't be beyond me to think that Peterson thinks that he's doing something that's never happened before. I mean, he's got a good idea of himself, and I mean he should. He's got a lot of good ideas, but his ideas are antagonistic in the end. They're antagonistic to this other side, and he continually finds himself in conflict. And I think if he was really, really serious as a philosopher, and I put serious philosophers, guys who maybe destroy stuff, but they're trying to make problems disappear, not through smashing them to bits and smashing more things, but as Wittgenstein did by undermining in understanding the language behind things and undermining the dispute itself so that it evaporates. That is what Peterson would need to do, and I'm not sure he's doing that or even capable of it.
No, I mean,
it's a very hard thing to do.
To break something apart and the trust that leads to something greater is a huge risk, and But
the crowd would need to evaporate. He would need the crowd to evaporate. Maybe he's taking the crowd on a ride, and he's gonna take them somewhere, and then he's gonna lead to its evaporation.
The great contradiction is that if Peterson is against totalitarianism, he's basically saying that anytime you sacrifice the individual in lieu of a greater common social goal, you lead to death, destruction of creativity, and destruction of civilization. I mean, if his message that the crowd would lead to that, and if he's telling people that, he would seem to be the anti-crowd philosopher. I mean, he's basically.
Well, let me ask you this. If Peterson tomorrow were to announce, I've had an assistant working with me for the last 30 years. He's a 5-foot Korean guy with a kind of a high nasally voice. Wears thick bifocal glasses. He's got a receding hairline. He's kind of pimpled. He is going to now be the one who speaks for me, and I am just going to retreat to Saskatchewan. This guy knows all of my ideas. He'll consult with me whenever there's issues. He's going to give my speeches. Live Nation now has booked him across the country in my place. What do you think would happen to his crowd?
It would dissipate very quickly.
Right. And I think that's the answer right there, is that his crowd is not really about these ideas. It's about his personality. He's created a cult of personality exactly in the same style of some of the left-wing totalitarians, which he
right. I mean, but what is really the difference between someone's personality and their work?
The answer is there is none. There absolutely is none. I mean, Wittgenstein would say that too. A man's style in his work and all this stuff. Nietzsche would say the same thing. Your philosophical ideas are about you. You are not talking about something that's universal in any way. And these guys get off on believing. Some of these guys, I would say, second tier philosophers think that they're talking about universal ideas outside them. And I think Peterson, he thinks these ideas are not actually him, and I think that's one of his mistakes. That he's discovered some truths that are outside of himself and his own experience and outside of his own style. And I don't think it's possible to do that in life.
Right. I mean, do you think that he could feel that his experience is very separate from the wisdom he's gathered? I mean, if you're a scholar of ancient wisdom and you're saying, hey, look, I really think that this stuff makes sense to me now, and I think that it made sense to people before, pick and choose, take it or leave it. I mean, is that the same thing as saying, this is what I've discovered because I am this person? I mean, you know better than anybody else. I mean, the quality of the translation is as good as the translator's understanding of the language into which they're translating. Is that the same idea, that he's really just a translator of all these disparate ideas, and there's a huge translation effect?
Well, I think every man is a translator to some degree or another, whether they actually carry out translations as we normally understand what they are from languages. But whenever you sit there and read a book and try and understand it, you're translating something into your experience. The danger, though, is to say that this is the only translation, and it's not. And Peterson, I think, gets into dangerous territory because he's advancing some idea of some truth that is beyond him, and he's saying some universal ideas. And I think perhaps that's that Jungian stuff, because he sort of advances sometimes. He'll talk about the brain, and he'll cite science, but then he'll cite mythology. It gives a very slippery idea of truth. He's not confining it to science or to religion. He's noting it in all these different areas, and I think he does that on purpose to try and say, look, there are a lot of truths that are all kind of pointing back to the same thing. But the way he outlines everything, by having a scientific idea that points in this direction, a Christian idea that points in this direction, some idea from his life that points in his direction, he's then posing a second-order derivative idea that encapsulates these things that comes from him. And I think he's advancing that as something that's universal in some ways, instead of saying this is still just Jordan Peterson. And you don't get around the problem of truth and, science having a truth and religion having a truth by saying, oh, all these truths are valid, and let me just interpret them in a way that they kind of line up with each other and point where I think they should be pointed. You've still posed a final single truth. You've just done it in a kind of almost like a Derrida way, where he would like take two texts and put them side by side, and you just kind of pick up resemblances between the two.
But you don't
yes,
think
Jordan Peterson
calls himself out as saying, "Look, this is my idea. This is the process that I went through. Everybody has to go through this process, and you're going to go through a different conclusion." I mean, is he not just leading people to a skill set and not a conclusion?
Well, I think he's trying to lead people to a skill set to deal with complexity and problems and to feel better about that, as a therapist should. But I guess the whole idea of a therapist is, are you trying to get results by any means necessary? And if you are, then you can draw from all sorts of different areas. But I don't know do you know this Jung guy much at all? I don't know him very well at all. And this seems to be the key to understanding Peterson. I wish I knew Jung better. I've never read any Jung.
I don't know much about the guy.
It's like
archetypes in Christianity,
archetypes and big stories.
That's all I know, yeah.
And generally I think it has something to do with there are these big stories that we have in us, I guess, and we have all these variations on them that are told in different cultures in different ways, and whether it's science or religion or whatever it is, we're just telling these archetypes, though, these stories. And I think it's just it's kind of a hazy idea of truth instead of a specific one. And I think by being hazy about the truth, you can get away from some of the scary games that truth can create with, like, totalitarian thinking, and there's a single truth and a one God, and this is the way you have to do everything. It turns into, yes, that's generally true, and truth then becomes something that's a little slippery, and that leads to a wider space for people and more justice, and nobody gets hurt then. You're less condemning of people who don't actually fit. But I still think you're firmly within a Western idea of truth and falsity that emerges with Plato and it emerges with the Greeks. Just by making it hazy, I don't think you get out of the problem. So you still run into problems, philosophical problems and big disputes. They're just based on hazy stuff instead of very, very clear, rigorously defined stuff.
Yeah, but I'd like to see how hazy Peterson thinks the Inuit are, because apparently this guy was affected by the tribes up where he grew up. He was adopted to the tribe. He built half of his home in the style of the tribe. I mean, I'd be curious to see if he's been influenced by, like, Inuit thinking.
But that's one thing he doesn't talk about a lot. And I know that you and I have both gained a tremendous amount from physical exhaustion and pushing ourselves, whether it was on bicycles and on trips or racing, physical sports, challenges. These sorts of physical things have, I would say, for both you and I, probably been our greatest source of joy. I mean, yeah, philosophy is a lot of fun to do. It's fun to create stuff. It's fun to write stuff, and there's a lot of joy there too. But that joy you get from the exhaustion of the body, the endorphins
maybe this
flowing,
guy hasn't been writing a lot. Maybe this guy has been
world.
building houses and just getting out of this state of exhaustion. I mean, maybe Peterson has been living some great Inuit life that we don't even know about, and this is just.
Yeah, but I would often say if there was some young man with a lot of problems, I would say, hey bud, did you ever do any sports? Did you ever try to run around a track, get yourself tired? Did you ever do it on a long bike ride? Did you ever try and climb a mountain? I would say before you get all anxiety stricken and worried, and just go tire your body out,
or do a sport where you can actually die. I mean,
just get so
climbing
tired.
is a great example.
Yeah, get worried about your own life, your mortality, and then ask yourself about these issues you seem to have, and these feelings, or this sense of order and chaos. I mean, all that stuff disappears, man. Philosophy disappears real quick.
When you ain't got no water, when you got no
disappear
water
real
and the
quick.
wind is blowing you to the cactuses, order and chaos.
Well, I mean, we discussed it on an earlier podcast. Like the best part of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is the end, where it's this rigorous logic stuff, which is very, very dry to read, the logical origins of the world, and then it becomes this whole stuff about religion and the mystical, and about how language ends at a certain point, and at the most important point when everything really, really important begins. And philosophy is this ladder that we climbed up now. We need to kick it away, and now we need to really shut up and deal with the most important stuff in silence. Now, that came out of a philosopher who had the bullets whizzing by him in the trenches of World War I. That's where these ideas came from. And that's the thing, man. Therapy is a physical thing. You need to come back to the world, not talk more about the world, or get a therapist and sit in a room or read books. These things are not going to cure you. They'll give you arguments for why you should feel differently, but no argument ever stopped a bullet. The bullet's coming, man.
Yeah, the bullet's coming, and that's what every guy in the front dock knows. I mean, they know the story of Felix. They know the story of going into the hold every day. I mean, they know that somebody's going to potentially drop on you. You'll get injured. You'll freeze to death. The reality of Alaska in the front dock is that A, you've got to meet the schedule. You have to actually take what your customer's giving you. And B, you can die or get killed in the midst of doing it.
Well, you know what they say. You know what they say. They say like there are no atheists in the foxholes.
The Filipinos cross themselves before they go in the hold.
They also say there are no. They also say there are no philosophers on front dock. That's the flip side.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have time to write when you're exhausted and you're falling asleep on the forklift between shifts, and you don't have time to think about the meaning of like equality when you're just getting dumped the wrong mix of fish in the sorting belt. I mean, these. I mean, and when you're on the boat, I mean, you basically are in the middle of no statehood. When you go past the breakwaters, there's no state.